Um, well, this PowerPoint, again, it was not constructed from your text, but from a different one. But basically, it talked about three different arguments for the forms. An epistemological argument, one from the theory of knowledge, that says that the forms must be there if there are to be stable, unchanging objects of real knowledge. Okay? And then we looked at the metaphysical argument. What Plato does what the 20th century philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine called the reification of universals. That is, he makes them into real entities. In other words, if two objects, like two chairs, share a property in common, namely chairness, then there must really be a property that they share in common. And so chairness must somehow exist as a property separate from individual chairs. You know, and I illustrated this, you know, in the previous argument by talking about things sharing the property of squareness, right? Two particular squares, they share the property of squareness in common. So that's what's called the metaphysical argument. Metaphysics and philosophy deals with what's real, what exists. And so Plato has a view of reality that's populated by a lot of things, right? In addition to individual squares, there's also, for him, really existing the property of squareness. In addition to all the individual chairs in this room, there also is existing apart from them, and in addition to them, the property of squareness. I mean, the property of chairness, if you want to call it that. And so Plato has a view of reality where there are a lot of things in his view. You know, there are these abstract, what are called essences of things, essential properties, essential natures of things, in addition to the particular things themselves. So his answer to whether there is something universal or whether all that exists is particular is that, yes, there are really existing universal entities, which he calls the forms. So that's the... and then finally, semantics deals with the meaning and the reference of words. And so if proper names, I mean, all of us in this room were given a proper name, right? You know, mine was Victor Morawski, right? I never liked my middle name, which is Eugene, until I took Greek, and I found that in Greek it means well-born. So I thought, well, that makes me feel a little bit better about Eugene, but I still never use it, right? But the point is, Victor Morawski is the name of a particular person and refers to that person. And if we were, say we had an elephant in the zoo and the elephant's name was Gertrude, well, Gertrude would be the proper name of a particular elephant, but all elephants for Plato share in common the property of, for lack of a better word, call it elephantness, or the essential nature of being an elephant. And so this part of Plato's view says that general words like squareness, beauty itself, elephantness, chairness, are the proper names of forms. So just as a name like Gertrude is the proper name of an individual elephant, so the word elephant is the proper name of a form elephant. That is, that it names this general property. So for Plato then, now we didn't go into the pre-Socratics in any big way. You saw Parmenides portrayed. He said nothing changes. And for Plato, that's what ultimate reality needs to be. Changeless, eternal. And he says that's what characterizes the world of the forms. It's also where the gods are for him, and also where our soul goes when it leaves the body between incarnations, if we've been good philosophers. Now Plato also says if we haven't been good philosophers and we've been too concerned about things in this world, our souls might be, instead of ascending up to be with the forms, they might fall back down to earth, and you could end up, as a disembodied spirit wandering around graveyards at night, not being able to escape this world. So when we signed you up for philosophy, we didn't tell you that was one of the side benefits, that there's, if you take this philosophy course, there's less of a chance that you'll end up as a disembodied spirit wandering around graveyards in the afterlife. So you got that going for you. It's kind of like Bill Murray in Caddyshack. He says he once caddied for the Dalai Lama. And he's at the end of the round, and he's saying, well, how about a little something for the effort? How about a little tip here? And the Dalai Lama said that there's nothing right now, but when you die, you will achieve total enlightenment. So Bill Murray says, so I got that going for me. I, by the way, actually saw the Dalai Lama in person. He was visiting in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia. That was pretty amazing, to see somebody like that, a world-class figure. So anyway, Parmenides says nothing changes and things are changeless realities. In other words, the property of squareness doesn't change. It's eternally the same for Plato. So if we're rid of this, things like perfect equality, perfect beauty or beauty itself, squareness, triangularity, for Plato he calls these forms, and rather than being imaginary entities, for him they have a greater existence because they have an eternal, unchanging existence than particular things. Particular squares and triangles come into existence, they go out of existence, right? I could draw a triangle on the board and erase it, 2 seconds later. But the property of triangularity for Plato exists in a more full sense. Now, I'm not, there are problems with this view of reality, all right? But I'm asking you to at least kind of understand, this view. So for Plato, there are two worlds, right? There is what he calls the sensible world, and here we may as well put a few things down. there's what Plato calls, yeah, sorry, I'm going to try to do the sensible world. Right? And hold on. Actually, I want the next slide. So the forms supposedly are perfect, and they contain only their qual. So there's the world of sense experience, right? In which things are in constant change. They contain objects which, for him, are in a state of becoming. In other words, since they're always changing, they're always becoming something else. I mentioned last week that I happened to walk home from the grocery store past the graveyard, and I was noticing that even, some of these 150-year-old gravestones, sometimes you can't read half the writing on them because they've deteriorated. Even rocks, even stone, changes in this world, right? So this was the world that the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who said you can't step in the same river twice, the same waters twice, because they're constantly changing. That's the world of sense experience. Now, the sensible world is the world inside the cave. The shadows are images of things in, I'm going to say, this world. Right, that's what they represent. The fire represents the sun, right? The prisoners of course, are us. And in other words, for Plato, he knows that we're in this world, right? We're inside the cave. This is a way that, for him, we're like the prisoners, right? As I said last week, we and Madonna are in the material world here, right? But we also tend to think, see, Plato knows that the average person out there in his day is like the average person today, and they think that the most real things are what they can see, touch, taste, feel, what they can experience with their senses, like this particular table up here. But what Plato's trying to convince you of is the form of tableness has more existence, than a particular table. So, the objects, carried by people are, material objects. Objects in this world. And, of course, the, person leading the released prisoner, as we said last time, is like the philosophy teacher, and specifically Socrates, and the released prisoner is the philosophy student. And So this world is known by the senses. For Plato, this part is known not by the senses but by reason. It's our reasoning abilities that put us in touch with these lasting truths. So, as far as, you know, the intellectual or intelligible world, for Plato, that's the world of you know, the forms. Right, representing, you know, the one that up top. So it's the world of the forms, and it's the outside. Well, let's say it's the world outside the cave. Right, and so it's like the end point of your philosophical journey, and you know, objects outside the cave represent forms. All right, so there's like Plato's two worlds. You know, the world inside the cave, which is the world you and I grow up in. But note how Plato is trying to completely change our views about what's real. For Plato, the forms are more real than particular objects. And also, the sun in the outside world represents what he calls the form of the good, with a capital G. Goodness itself. You know, just as the form of a square is squareness itself, the form of the good for Plato is the ultimate standard of moral right and wrong, of moral goodness. Okay? Now, this is a good way to transition into some of Aristotle's ethics. Plato, at the end, I'm not going to give you the argument because it's kind of involved, but Plato had some reservations about his claim that there's a separate world of forms. But he seemed to have held on to this view of reality. And by the way, Socrates claimed to not have a lot of interest in theories of reality, which were the kinds of things that the pre-Socratic philosophers were really concerned about. What kind of stuff is the world made of? So you say, well, wait a second. We call this Plato, but in the dialogue itself, it is Socrates in the Republic who gets out this very complicated theory of reality. And he said, well, wait a second. On the one hand, Socrates says he's more concerned about what philosophy has to say about what is a good life for a human being. And, you know, how ought we to live. And he wasn't that concerned with theories of reality. And here's Socrates in Plato's book, The Republic, getting out this long, involved, two-tiered theory of reality. What's going on here? Well, here's what I think is the best explanation. It has to do, I once sat next to an expert in ancient philosophy coming home from a conference on an airplane. And actually, I think he was going to a conference. And he said, in theology, people who didn't take the Bible literally had problems with, well, who was Jesus? If you're not going to believe or take the scriptural records at face value, then you wind up asking, well, who was he anyway? And what he mentioned to me is that the same kind of debate was going on among scholars in ancient philosophy, not about the character of Jesus, but about the character of Socrates. Who was Socrates anyway? How much of what we see in Plato's dialogues is accurate? We know that even Socrates himself didn't think the portrait that Aristophanes painted of him was accurate. He tried to distance himself from that. And the view that I think is the best one on this, and I'm not going to ask you a specific question on a test about this, but to put things in perspective, is the view that the early dialogues, like the Meno, the Apology, the Phaedo, the Crito, were dialogues that Plato wrote in part to try to set the record straight as to who Socrates really was. And the portrait you get of Socrates there is not of Socrates, the great metaphysician. This theory of forms comes out in what's called Plato's middle period. It's not one of the early dialogues. It's located in a dialogue called The Republic. And the point is, as you get into the middle and later dialogues, you find more and more Plato putting his own views into the mouth of Socrates as a character. Now, in many ways, they were in agreement with stuff that Socrates taught, because Socrates did think there were things like forms, but they're much more worked out in detail. And Plato is much more concerned about abstract theories of reality, you know, and so that's why we refer to this more as Plato's theory of forms than Socrates, because he was the one who really worked this out in detail, even though in the book, The Republic, it's put into the mouth of Socrates as a character. So probably the farther on you get in Plato's writing period, the more you get of Plato in the character Socrates in the dialogues, and the less of the historical Socrates is what we're saying. So Aristotle disagreed. We're not doing Aristotle's theory of reality, but on this issue of whether the forms exist separately. In some sense, for Plato, the form of chairness exists in every particular square. These are called immanent forms or immanent characters. And the form of squareness somehow exists in every particular square, but it also exists eternally in this other realm where our soul supposedly goes between incarnations. And that's Plato's view. Now, one of the ways you can describe Plato's view is if all of a sudden, say, all of the tables in the world went out of existence tomorrow, for him, there still would be the form of tableness existing eternally as the blueprint that sets the standard for what a table is. Whereas for Aristotle, forms only exist, and the way that they say it is embodied in particulars. In other words, the form of tableness only exists in particular tables. The form of squareness only exists in particular squares. So Aristotle's view is, yes, things have essences, but there isn't a separate world of forms existing apart from particular things. Forms exist in things. But for Aristotle, if all the tables went out of existence, so would the form of tableness. And there's the difference. For Plato, if all the tables were gone, the form of tableness would still, in some sense, be around. Now, here's the thing. In Plato's other world of the forms, there's a kind of hierarchy of forms according to how abstract they are. In other words, forms of particular objects are lower than forms of things like geometric objects, which are more abstract, and forms for concepts like beauty, equality, justice. They're higher on the ladder of forms. And for Plato, at the top of the heap is the form of the good in this world, symbolized by the sun in the outside world. And that, for Plato, is the ultimate standard for moral goodness, for goodness in ethics. Now, you can say, well, wait a second, Professor Murawski. I thought you said that for Aristotle there wasn't any separate world of the forms. Well, if for Aristotle there's no separate world of the forms, wouldn't that also mean that if there is no such world, there also is no form of the good, or goodness itself, as the ultimate standard for ethics? Yes. For Aristotle, he looks elsewhere for the ultimate standard of ethics. And for Aristotle, the ultimate goal of ethics is happiness in this life, not imitating an abstract form of the good. So that's the difference between the two. Any questions? I think I took 40. We only have 10 minutes. So any questions there? All right. Well, rather than start this now, and just it's about 25 minutes long, and this one I usually play all of it. Some of them I don't. So we'll look at this video next time, Wednesday. We're supposed to be in the 50s by Wednesday, so hopefully we don't get snowed out on Wednesday. Yeah, I know. I have an 8 o'clock class at Essex tomorrow that might be snowed out if we have a late opening. So I've made visible to you the PowerPoint on Aristotle's ethics. So we'll look at that next time. At least we'll begin it. It's not a real long PowerPoint. So next time we'll look at the video on that, and because it doesn't make much sense to just start it, you know, and only play a few minutes of it. We'll start it from the beginning next time. But at any rate, that's kind of how the allegory or the myth of the cave symbolizes Plato's two-tiered theory of reality. This world is inside the cave. Outside the cave is this other world of the forms, you know. So, okay. Well, thank you very much. I called the roll, so if you came in after that, let me know that you're here. And let me so I did do integrity recording.